Okay, so we've talked in some detail about the English vowel system now, and I'm on section 3 of the vowel handout, where I'm going to talk about vowels more generally and more systematically about how we're going to be classifying vowels in this class. So here's everything that you need to know about vowels for this class in order to classify any vowel or deal with any kind of data from any kind of language. We're just going to be using 4 dimensions, and really it's only 3.5. I'll explain why in a second. So there's going to be height. We're going to distinguish between high, low, and mid vowels. There's going to be backness. We're going to refer to as back, central, and front vowels. There's going to be rounded and unrounded vowels. We call that vowel rounding. And then this 4th dimension, tense lax, is really mostly for English. There's a few other Germanic languages that have similar tense lax contrasts. But for most languages, we're just going to need the first 3. Height, backness, and rounding. That's a full description of a vowel, except in English, where you also need to say whether it's tense and lax. Okay, so let's go through each of these briefly and talk about them. Dimension 1 is vowel height. And although they'll sometimes tell you in your textbook that it's about your tongue height, if you're looking for a physical correlate, it's going to be closer to your jaw height than your tongue height. And so one way of looking at this is by going from a very high front vowel to a very low front vowel. So let me draw my quadrilateral here. So again, here's E, A, and A. Oh, and sorry, I forgot I. E, A, A. If you glide all the way down this height scale, you can actually see my jaw move. Here's how you would do that, by saying yeah really slowly. Yeah. You see my jaw moving down? Yeah. So try it yourself, you'll feel your jaw moving. Now in acoustics, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, we haven't done this yet, but I just wanted to put this in here. Vowel height is going to correspond to the first formant value. A high, and it's going to correspond inversely. So a formant is a particular kind of acoustic measurement that we take, and it has to do with which frequencies we find lots of energy at. Right? And so having a high first formant means that you're a low vowel. Having a low first formant means that you're a high vowel. So it goes the opposite direction from physical height. Right? Dimension 2 is vowel backness, right? Front, back. There's a very rough correspondence with tongue position here. This is why I don't like using the tongue position idea from the textbook, because I find it pretty hard to sense this, and that's because the correlation is very imperfect. That said, you might be able to feel if you say you very slowly. So E to oo, you're going to be gliding along this front-back dimension. You might be able to feel your tongue body moving back. Of course, in English, because the back vowel is rounded and the front vowel is unrounded, it's going to be more salient that your lips are changing, at least to me, but you might also feel your tongue body moving backwards somewhat. There's a much better correspondence with vowel backness for the second formant, or it's sometimes called F2 in the literature, and we're going to be learning about formants shortly. Right? So that's a much better way of thinking about what vowel backness is. It's about the second formant of the vowel. Dimension 3 is lip rounding, and English, as we mentioned, has rounded and unrounded vowels, but there is no pure rounding contrast in English. Instead, most back vowels are rounded and all front vowels are unrounded. That turns out, actually, cross-linguistically, to be a very, very common pattern. So in terms of the languages spoken in this classroom, I believe the same thing is true in Spanish, the same thing is true in Arabic, the same thing is true in Italian. These all have the same generalization, that all front vowels are unrounded, while most back ones, and in particular non-low back vowels, are all unrounded. So this are all rounded. The back vowels are rounded except for the low one. So this is probably not an accident. This seems to be cross-linguistically very, very common. We're going to talk about that a bit later as well. So that said, none of those languages that I just mentioned have pure rounding contrasts because the difference between any unrounded vowel and any rounded vowel is more than just rounding. There's also a front-back difference. That said, lots of languages do have pure rounding contrasts. And if you want to see some really elaborate and kind of spectacular examples of lots and lots of rounded, unrounded vowel contrasts, Germanic languages are good for this, except for English. So go take a look at the Course of Phonetics website. They have some examples from German and Swedish that are super interesting with lots of round, unround vowel pairs that are really hard for English speakers to pronounce, but also to perceive. It's hard to even tell which vowels are which. There's lots of other languages that have rounding contrast. They might not be quite as spectacular as German or Swedish. Here's some examples in French, which we also have, I think, a native French speaker in this class. Forgive my terrible French, it's all I got. So yeah, here is a three-way distinction between front unrounded, front rounded, and back rounded in French. For instance, the word ni means to deny, or not to deny. It's a verb. It's an inflected form of deny for the first, second, or third person. And the word ni with this vowel means nude. Whereas, so to English speakers, oftentimes this one sounds like an oo because that's the only rounded vowel we know up there. It's not. In French, there's a third back-rounded vowel, as in nous, which means us or we. Right? So ni, nous. That's a three-way distinction. Same thing with the mid-vowels here. You can have front unrounded a, as in ve. That means go, first person. Right? You can have front rounded as in ve. That means want, first person. And you can have back rounded o, as in vo, which is again, the word for veal, for the meat of young cows. Yeah, ve, vo. So three-way contrast there in French, including this pure rounding contrast up here in the vowel space. Pretty common cross-linguistically. Out of the languages spoken in this class, I think also Mandarin has at least one round and round vowel contrast. I think it's this one, but I might be wrong about that. So those are the first three dimensions that we're thinking about here. Vowel height, vowel backness, and lip rounding. And those are going to be the three most important for all the languages that we study in this class, except for English. Right? The fourth dimension, tenseness, is relevant mainly in English. And this one, again, is super complicated. This is one of the components of why the English vowel system is so difficult and complicated. And this tense-lax distinction is really kind of odd. So unlike the other things we just looked at, where it's pretty clear that lip rounding corresponds to your lips, and height has something to do with your jaw, or maybe with a formant, and backness might have to do with your tongue, or maybe with a formant, tenseness isn't just one thing. There's a whole bunch of different things going on here. So tense and lax vowels in English differ in their duration. So tense vowels like a are much longer than lax vowels like e. So in a word like bait and a word like bet, you'll find that that a vowel is almost twice as long as the e one. So the tense ones are much longer. They differ in vowel height. That's shown on this chart. The tense one's a little bit above the lax one. Tense one's a little bit above the lax one. E, a, e. That said, a actually has no tense counterpart, so it's not clear how that applies to that one. They differ in their phonology. Right? And so here's one sense in which they differ in their phonology, and I find this to actually be a useful decision maker about which vowels are tense and lax in English. In a one-syllable word, a tense vowel can be the end of a one-syllable word. Right? So for instance, there are words in English like bay and woe and you and yeah, so on and so forth. There's lots of words like this. there are no words in English that are one-syllable words that end in a lax vowel. There is no such word as be. That is not a possible English word. You can't have a word like wa. That's not a possible English word. You can't have a word like y. Not a possible English word. So tense vowels, for consistency, I should have drawn that over there. Tense vowels can be the end of a one-syllable word. Lax vowels can't. That's one easy way of classifying them. That makes this more of a phonological difference than a phonetic one. Finally, these two kinds of vowels differ in their history about when they entered the language, how they entered the language, what they sounded like when they came from Proto-Germanic or from early English to Middle English to late English. There are lots and lots of complicated changes to the vowel system of English over the last 800 years. So that has made the distinction between tense and lax vowels a little bit mysterious and hard to reconstruct. And some of them come from different periods of language contact. You get different vowels coming in from French after the Norman Conquest than you had before the Norman Conquest. You get wholesale changes to the vowel system. So the history of these tense and lax vowels is extremely complicated in English, and that's reflected in their spelling. So we saw this briefly the other day, that there's all of these extremely weird spellings in English, and that's because it's reflecting the linguistic history of the language, which is extremely complicated. So when I define tense and lax vowels for English, I tend to use the phonological criterion. I find this easiest to think about, right? But not everybody agrees about that, and so you'll read different things about tense versus lax vowels in different textbooks. Everybody has something different to say about this. I'm going to mostly think about it in phonological terms. One more thing I want to mention here, because when we study distinctive features a little bit later this semester, you're going to see people referring to this contrast sometimes as an ATR contrast, where the tense vowels are plus ATR and the lax vowels are minus ATR. ATR stands for advanced tongue root. And what that refers to is that in some vowels, you pull the root of your tongue forward, that very bottommost part of your tongue that's just above your glottis in your pharynx. And when you pull that forward, it enlarges the pharynx. It makes it wider than in non-ATR vowels. This kind of a distinction is super common in Bantu languages. Bantu is one of the largest language families in the world. It's hundreds of languages spoken in Africa are Bantu languages. Also, some other African language families have ended up with ATR systems, whether that's from contact with Bantu or independently. You get ATR systems in a lot of African languages. Because the tongue root is attached to the rest of the tongue, that motion where you pull your tongue root forward tends to affect vowel height to some extent, and vice versa. Right? So if you pull the root of your tongue forward, it's attached to the body of your tongue. So possibly the body of your tongue is going to come forward a little ways as well. That's how you could end up with plus ATR vowels like E being a little bit higher in fronter than minus ATR vowels like I. Same thing in English, though. If we're really just looking for a slightly higher fronter vowel, well, the body of your tongue is attached to your tongue root. So maybe it's going to pull your tongue root forward when you do that. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that that's exactly right. That the English vowels are not real ATR specifications. They're really about the tongue body position, about height and backness, and it pulls the tongue root along. But that's very different in languages with real ATR contrasts, like in Bantu, than it is in the English tense lax distinction. So in English, there's going to be incidental movement of the tongue root because you're producing a higher in fronter vowel here. In Igbo, which is the language shown here, which is a language spoken in Nigeria, it's not Bantu, this has a real ATR distinction. And in ATR languages, it's the tongue root specifically that's being primarily moved, and it happens to have some carry-on effects on the tongue body. So it's fine to refer to these English contrasts as ATR if you want to, but you just need to keep in mind this is a very different ATR feature than real ATR contrasts like in Igbo. And you can see this in the phonology. They pattern totally differently in the phonology in ATR languages than they do in tense lax languages like English. So shown on the upper right hand side of your vowel handout, page 4, is actually X-ray tracings from a study of an Igbo speaker producing ATR and non-ATR versions of E and U. Now, the ATR version, it's very hard to see. Yeah, you can't read the symbols in this diagram, but they're giving you little, probably under diacritics here that either go left for the ATR one or go right for the non-ATR, or sometimes called retracted tongue root version. So these are two versions of the high vowels in Igbo, and the solid lines are tracings of the tongue body for the plus ATR vowels, and the dashed lines are the tracings for the minus ATR versions of the vowels. In the left illustration, it's the high front vowels, where you can see the plus ATR one has that backmost part of the tongue well to the left of the minus ATR one. It's pulled forward towards the lips and the teeth in the front of the face. That's your tongue root. There's also a little bit of a difference in the position of the tongue body, but that's probably just a byproduct. Similarly, in the right panel, that's the back vowel, high back vowel, and you can see there again the solid line corresponding to the ATR vowel has a much fronter tongue root than the back line, the dashed line corresponding to the non-ATR vowel. And you can see there's a solid line all the way at the right of those illustrations. That's the back wall of the throat, basically, of the pharynx. So you can see that with the solid lines in these pictures, you're going to have a much larger pharynx than you would with the dashed lines. Right? That's how ATR affects vowel quality. So that's all I had to say about dimensions of vowel contrast. I've listed a couple of other kinds of vowel things that happen here and said if we have time we'll take a look at them. So I'll record another short video where I briefly discuss laryngeal settings, nasalization, and duration.